Okay, thank you for coming. Great to see people here. So yeah, when I suggested to Grace I might do this presentation as part of the TVAD series of talks, seems quite a long time ago, and I was full of, I think it was the end of the academic year, and I was full of confidence that by the time this came around, I'd be well advanced with the book and I'd have lots of really focused things to say about it. And of course it comes around and I think, oh, okay, I think I've started the first chapter. But what I thought I would do is talk around why I'm doing the book, how it comes to be being written, and really what it's about. Because one of the things that's become very noticeable to me while I've been researching, and I have been working on it in the sense that I've been doing what we would call our students, tell our students, a lit review. And the lit review is taking rather longer than I thought because there's far more written than I ever thought there had been. And that's one of the challenges I've kind of met. So partly this is about identifying why the thing I'm working on is actually worth doing because it's not been done before in quite the same way. So really the structure of the presentation is, hello. A bit of background, and because this is quite unusual in a sense, most of the stuff I do as part of my academic research is based in or around my background subject, which is English Lit, and then coming into teaching in the School of Creative Arts. I've of course worked a lot with animators and model students and film students and art students and so on. So I've become more interested in scholarly work around visual culture, particularly film, but also bits of graphic design and so on. But this is a little bit like coming home and deeply, deeply self-indulgent because this takes me back very much in a biographical way to where I kind of started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the structure of the thing that I'm writing and the kind of themes that it will be touching upon, and hopefully showing a few little clips and so on as well. I should say while I'm here, just to offset the health values of the fruit, there are jelly babies. Please pass them around. Okay, so where shall I start? I know a lot of people in the room are actually Doctor Who fans. How many people would count themselves a fan? Okay. How many people count themselves reasonably well aware of what the thing is? How many people are complete novices? Okay. So it depends how much, on that, it depends how much background I go into in terms of the stuff which fans would already know. But I suppose the interesting thing here is most of the stuff I write is me as an academic. This is me as what's now termed an ACA fan. Which is this kind of weird hybrid of a fan and an academic. And I always thought, and I always kind of counsel students, don't write about things that are part of your kind of hobbies because you'll ruin the hobby and you won't be able to do it objectively enough to be an academic. But I'm having to retrain myself a little bit around that notion. So, hopefully, the sonic screwdriver will work. So, this is the array of faces. These are the characters, the actors who've played the main role. And of course, they're all white men. And one of the little mythical myths that's sitting behind it, if we look at myth as a kind of ideological thing, is the kind of that aspect of it. And that's not something I'm going to go into deeply today, but it is something which will be kind of in the threaded through the study, I think. And of course, what I'm really focusing on, because the thing is called Once Upon a Time Lord, I suggested the title as a joke to the publisher, and they liked it better than the one I'd given them already, because the marketing people said, "Oh, we like that one." It was strictly meant as a joke. Once Upon a Time Lord, the myths and stories of Doctor Who. And I'm really interested in Doctor Who as a storytelling phenomenon, as a narrative thing. And these are the faces at the front of the narrative. And they will all be familiar to most of you, I suspect. With some strange sort of additions, this kind of semi-official war doctor character who slotted in and completely upset all the numbering. When Doctor Who fans meet, they inevitably talk about things which are story-based. What was your first story? What's the first one you remember? What's your favourite story? Which of the missing stories do you wish they could find, and so on? Stories is kind of central to what the thing is. So, it doesn't go through people. It's a very quick potted history. Just to kind of give a little bit of perspective, I will race through this, probably because there's some errors in it. So the origins of things start in the early 1963, probably the back end of 62. There were discussions in the BBC to develop a science fiction series, as they were thinking at the time. The thing that fascinates me about Doctor Who, really, and why I think it's a myth, and a proper myth, is that nobody really authored it. It doesn't come from any one person. You can take Star Trek, you can take Buffy, and you can ascribe them to a particular creator. You can't do that with Doctor Who. It was pretty much put together by committee. Now, there are some quite prominent names in that committee. and they are really the kind of creators. But I think, although the BBC owns Doctor Who and makes a tremendous amount of money out of it every year, in some ways it's a story which is owned by everyone, and the amount of fan fiction that's produced, and also some bits of the history where the fans kind of took over creating the story, makes it, I think, quite distinctive in that way. But if you go back to early 1963, BBC had a new head of drama, Sidney Newman. He was a Canadian, had been working over at independent television, but came over to the BBC. One of the first projects he began to work on was this science fiction series. There are really three people who tend to get named as kind of the committee, but there were other people floating around as well. Sidney Newman, who was head of drama, Donald Wilson, who was head of scripts, later got a slightly more fancy title, C.E. Webber, who was a staff writer at the BBC. And they sort of worked through the idea, but it took shape quickly. But when you look at the early production notes they made and sort of ideas, it's quite different from what we ended up with. And I think some of the things that happened are the things which have made it last, because they're odd. It doesn't really sit very well within science fiction genre, which is something I'll come to later. Very strikingly for the time, and actually very strikingly for the history of Doctor Who since, the first producer was a woman, a young woman, Verity Lambert, appointed by Sidney Newman, who'd seen some of her work and liked it. One of his first instructions to her was there were to be no bug-eyed monsters. It was a very Reithian thing about Doctor Who. It was meant to be educational, which is why a lot of the early stories were pure histories. They soon dropped that idea once they realised that the bug-eyed monsters worked rather well. But of course, in the second story, she brought in the Daleks, who are bug-eyed monsters. First episode, An Unearthly Child, was aired on Saturday, 23rd of November, 5:15. Actually, it was a few minutes late. It's actually the day after the assassination of JFK. And so the episode was repeated a week later before the running of the second episode, because it was thought people had been a little bit distracted by news from America. It then ran for 26 years with one little 18-month hiatus around 1986, and then it stopped for a while. A few things to note. 21st December 1963, first appearance of a Dalek. This is the second story, but the first episode of the second story. And just at the end, Barbara Wright is backs against this futuristic shiny wall, and this sink plunger appears, and she screams. That's the first bit you see of the Dalek, that you get the full frontal Daleks the week after. 29th of October 1966, and this is one of the big imaginative leaps, and I think the programme has been very good at, often for improvised reasons because of pragmatic needs, they've actually brought up some really imaginative ideas. The notion of actually regenerating the first actor into another actor was a stroke of genius. You ensure brand continuity and so on, but you also put something different into the mix. And that sort of renewal at regular intervals has been part of what's kept it fresh and also enables it to be attacked from a different angle. Hartnell was ill. He had arteriosclerosis and various other things which were affecting his memory. He wasn't learning lines. There are, within fan culture of Doctor Who, there's a phrase called Billy Fluffs. These are the William Hartnell mistakes when he gets his script wrong. They didn't have time to edit them out. So they kind of remain, and they're very affectionately viewed. My favourite is in a story called The Mythmakers, where he's talking to a young Greek serving maid who thinks he's a god, and he yells out, "I am not a dog," which is nice. Unfortunately, that episode's actually lost, so it's lost, but it's a wonderful thought. Just to note, it wasn't referred to as regeneration for a very long time. That's quite a late addition. So Patrick Troughton came in. He stayed until the end of June 1969, so the end of the month in which I was born, but I don't remember that. He was taken to trial by his own people. Worth pointing out at this point, and this is part of the mythology, for the first 6 years, we didn't know where the Doctor came from, we didn't know who his people were, he was a mystery. Tulloch and Alvarado, who were the first people to write a full-length book on the subject, talk about the hermeneutic code of early Doctor Who, that it was very much an emphasis on Doctor Who. There was a mystery. And it's argued that one of the problems with the later original series in the late 80s was they added too much detail around him. Too much was known. The Time Lords were well known by then, and they were actually rather dull. They were just a bunch of bureaucrats who had meetings and argued with each other, and that kind of undermined a lot of the mystery. So it's quite nice to note that you didn't actually know who his people were until 1969. The Time Lords were finally revealed. They put him on trial for hot wiring a TARDIS and running away and interfering in other planets mainly. You weren't supposed to do that if you're a Time Lord. You meant to keep yourself to yourself. Non-interventionist policy. So he was found guilty. He was sentenced to have another change of appearance. So basically he lost a life. And to be sentenced to Earth in the 20th century. And that's when he becomes attached to unit. So those are the army years, the brigadier years, and so on. That's also when it becomes colour, 1970. So when John Pertwee debuts in Spearhead from Space, that's the first colour episode. He stayed until 1974. He's the first Doctor I remember. I'll show you in a second my earliest memory, because people will always ask. The students will already have seen this, sorry. You know what it is. But I do remember, my first Doctor Who memory is, I think, my first memory, full stop, which may be why it's kind of hardwired into me. So he stayed till the end of Planet of the Spiders, changing to Tom Baker, at which point I was outraged. Who the hell was this person? I didn't know who he was, didn't like him, didn't know this was going to happen. Was very upset for about a week, and then decided, oh, he's good. And he remains, before someone else, he's my favourite Doctor, because he's the one I kind of grew up with. And he was around so long. You know, when you think he came in when I was 5, he left when I was 12. That's quite a significant period in a young man's life. So he falls from a telescope dish in March 81. He turns into Peter Davison. I wept. 1984, Peter Davison left. I didn't weep, because by then I was a teenager and he didn't do such things. Became Colin Baker. This is where you get the 18-month hiatus and a lot of falling out of the BBC. And by this stage, the BBC, which had always been a little embarrassed by this thing and didn't quite understand why it had worked, but were quite happy to get the money from it, had kind of lost faith. Michael Grade had come in. He didn't like the series. He hated science fiction. He particularly hated Doctor Who. They were cutting the budgets in real terms. There were all sorts of issues with the production, perhaps with the direction it was going and so on. So Michael Grade called an 18-month halt to the thing, and then it came back in 1987 with a ludicrous idea, which was a 14-episode story based around another trial of the Doctor. Some nice stuff in between, but lots of very dull court scenes, which turned off casual viewers. Colin Baker fell out with the production with the BBC, refused to film a regeneration scene because he didn't want to go. So the regeneration scene into Sylvester McCoy was Sylvester McCoy in Colin Baker's outfit with a blonde wig on. 6th of December 1989, by which time, and I'll mention this in a second, I didn't really notice. The last episode of Survival, that was the last episode for 7 years until the co-production with the US production of the movie, the Paul McGann movie, and then again it wouldn't return until 2005. I'm just going to show a little bit of YouTube. I didn't edit this, unfortunately, but I think it's rather nice. It was prepared for the 50th anniversary, and it's really it's a kind of homage to everything that had happened up until that point. But there will be an ad before it, of course.
I've seen him. He's like fire and ice and rage. He's like the night and the storm in the heart of the sun.
When disaster comes, he's there. He brings the storm in his wake.
Who are you?
I'm the Doctor.
He has saved your lives so many times and you never even knew he was there. He never stops. He never stays. He never asks to be thanked.
Is no one interested in history?
Onwards.
Where's the TVAD? It's my home.
That's time and relative dimension in space.
The daft old man who stole a magic box.
I'm not a human being. I walk in eternity.
The Doctor, the man who keeps running, never looking back because he dare not, out of shame.
mean you're deliberately choosing to go on the run from your own people in a rackety old TARDIS?
Why not? After all, that's how it all started.
One day, I shall come back. Yes, I shall come back. Until then, there must be no regrets, no tears, no anxieties. Just go forward in all your beliefs and prove to me that I am not mistaken in mine.
I've seen whole armies turn and run away, and he'd just swagger off back to his TARDIS and open the doors with a snap of his fingers. The Doctor in the TARDIS. Next stop everywhere.
There are some corners of the universe which have bred the most terrible things. Things which act against everything that we believe in. They must be fought.
The final act of your life is murder.
Doctor, the word for healer and wise man throughout the universe. But if you carry on the way you are, what might that word come to mean?
The monsters and the Doctor. It seems you cannot have one without the other.
My name is the Master.
Everything that ever hated you is coming here tonight. You can't win this. You can't even fight it.
Times like this I could do with a Brigadier.
Brigadier, we've seen some times, Doctor.
I just can't let you out of my sight, can I?
Same as ever, eh, Brigadier?
Professor Riversong, archaeologist.
You've seen me before then?
Time travel. We keep meeting in the wrong order.
This is the day he finds out who I am.
People have travelled with me and I've lost them. Lost them all. Never again.
Pain and loss, they define us as much as happiness or love. Whether it's a world or a relationship. Everything has its time, and everything ends.
Is this death?
Please don't die. You're the most wonderful man, and I don't want you to die.
Dear? Sarah Jane?
This song is ending, but the story never ends.
It's the end. But the moment has been prepared for.
The Doctor is alive. He is a Time Lord.
When he's dying, his body, it repairs itself, it changes.
He will become a new man.
There's no point in being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes.
If you are an alien, how come you sound like you're from the north?
Lots of planets have a north. I say, what a wonderful butler. He's so violent.
You've had this place redecorated, haven't you? I don't like it.
You're completely mad.
I know.
Regeneration. A complete new life cycle.
When you began all those years ago, sailing off to see the universe, did you ever think you'd become this?
All of time and space, everything that ever happened or ever will. Where do you want to start? Didn't anyone ever tell you there's one thing you never put in a trap if you're smart, if you value your continued existence, if you have any plans about seeing tomorrow, there's one thing you never ever put in a trap.
The first question, the question that must never be answered, in plain sight. The question you've been running from all your life. Doctor Who? Doctor Who? Doctor Who?
This is where it started for me. Show a bit more clip and then I'll actually start talking. So this is 1972. I'm just short of 3 years old, and I vividly remember seeing this, and it kind of stuck. Oh, that's good. So that gripped me and it scared me, and I can look at it now and smile because it doesn't scare me anymore. And some things look absurd. Things which actually did really get to me at the time, like the fact that the Sea Devils are wearing string vests, which I later discovered was a decision of the director, who didn't like he thought they looked indecent without anything on. So he decided they had to have some clothes on, so the string vests came in, which I thought were... And when they brought them back in the 1980s, they didn't have the string vest. They were dressed as sort of samurai, and it was wrong, so wrong. One thing that I'm very interested in as part of what I'm doing is to look at Doctor Who as a design thing. I think it is in so many ways a classic of British design, in the costumes, in some of the iconic things like the sonic screwdriver, the TARDIS itself, the console room, the Daleks, of course. So I'm very interested in terms of its design as well as its kind of, and how that helps to tell the story and gives it a very distinct aesthetic as a storytelling mythology. This here is an image, I didn't take this myself, this is actually an image from the 1975 Blackpool Doctor Who exhibition. It was the first thing you saw as you went through the doors of the TARDIS as it looked. I pestered my dad, I was in Lancaster, which is where I grew up, it's only 40 minutes from Blackpool, so I pestered him to take me to this thing. I saw this, and if I remember rightly, the jaw was moving slightly and the eye was rolling. It's a T-Rex that it was from the story of the Invasion of the Dinosaurs. Anyway, I saw that. My dad managed to sort of push me past this thing and pay, went down the steps into the control room, saw all these monsters gathered around, and I ran straight out the other side and through the bookshop and into there was a cafeteria on the other side. Complete waste of my dad's money. He did take me back again the next year, but yeah, it completely threw me. Because we look at that now, and part of what I'll end on today is just looking at the Tyrannosaurus Rex at the time really impressed my dad. I remember him distinctly saying that's fantastic, but you look at it now and it looks not quite so fantastic. So one of the things I'm very interested in is the kind of mythologies of realism almost, how that code changes. I had it bad. This is me 1983 at the Longley exhibition, the convention for 20 years. Completely misjudged by the BBC in terms of its popularity, and my dad almost didn't speak to me for weeks afterwards because the amount of time we had to queue to get in and then queuing to meet actors and so on. But I did get to stand in the TARDIS looking incredibly unfashionable with a crew cut and dodgy trousers. That's me back at Blackpool after the new series had started. I think this is about 2008. There's that nice quote from Tom Baker's Doctor. Of course I'm being childish. No point being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes. But then I went into my wilderness years. In Doctor Who terms, at least. It's all right. It adds atmosphere. That's me as an undergraduate in Manchester. By this stage, I wasn't watching Doctor Who, or at least I wasn't owning up to it. I did kind of occasionally sneak a look at it when my flatmates were out and so on, but it wasn't a very cool thing to admit to liking, and I kind of wasn't very happy with where it had gone, and I had other things on my mind. There's a lovely quote, a very non-academic quote from Matt Hill's book, Fan Cultures, where he says, "I drifted away from Who fandom because of a teenage estimation that if I continued with this all-consuming passion, I would never, in a million years, have any chance of getting a girlfriend." It wasn't quite my motivation, but I think there was part of that. It just wasn't a cool thing to do. However, I did dip in occasionally. I remember vividly seeing The Curse of Fenric, which was one of the last stories, and liking that. And one of the things I missed, because I went into my wilderness years, I kind of missed some of the good stuff that was going on in the late 80s, and I didn't realise quite how the series makers were really pushing the mythical side of Doctor Who. They were trying to rebuild the myth to make it interesting and deep and mysterious again. And I didn't really pick up on that until quite a few years later, when I sort of came back to Sylvester McCoy and discovered things that I didn't even know had existed at the time, which are things like the Virgin New Adventures novels and so on, which I'll talk about shortly. At the time, to me, it looked very silly. Things like the Candyman from the Happiness Patrol just looked, Bertie Bassett, it seemed wrong. It didn't seem like the programme I remembered. But actually, if you read the novelisation, it's not Bertie Bassett at all. It's this really terrifying zombie creature who's covered in sort of glucose preservative stuff, very odd. But at the time, which I was missing, the script editor, Andrew Cartmel, had what's since become known as his master plan, which was to try and recreate the Doctor as this really very mysterious figure. Missing the other, there was this notion that the Doctor was more than just a Time Lord. He was some sort of ancient figure from the past of Gallifrey who'd been there at the creation of the black hole that powered the Time Lord's powers of time travel and so on. So he became this kind of really mysterious figure, which was really played up. There's a lot of times when he's manipulating events, or he's not telling his companion what's going on, kind of storing things. So it was an attempt to kind of build up that hermeneutic code, the kind of mystery of the series. But I missed all that. I've only come back to that, comparatively recently. And this is what was going on at the time. Now, from a fan point of view, this is intriguing, and in many ways, I think, God, I missed the boat here. These were published by Virgin, the New Adventures, and then they were the kind of continuing adventures of Sylvester McCoy's Doctor and Ace, and then various other companions woven around it. And then they produced a series called The Missing Adventures, which were kind of backfillers. So they took the previous Doctors and began to write stories. These were much more adult. I mean, really adult. Some of them are involved issues of drugs. There's sex in some of them. The first one I read is the first one of the series, Time Worm Genesis, which has topless early teenage prostitutes wandering around in ancient Mesopotamia, and it wasn't, and themes of kind of incest and things, which just were not part of the main series. So it was kind of an attempt by, and these were all fans, but you'll notice some of the names: Mark Gatiss, Paul Cornell, Russell T Davies. This is one of the big Finnish audio adventures, which began in 1999 while the series was off air, and again, it's continuing the adventures in a different format. Human Nature, many of you will know, was actually, it was a Sylvester McCoy novelisation, but it became a David Tennant story. Some of the themes from the Return series as well. The Russell T Davies one takes place partly on a council estate, a tower block, which was obviously when he brought it back in 2005, he brought in that sort of tower block, almost soap opera element as well. So when it did regenerate, it tried in 1996, didn't quite work, but I was interested, I was watching. When it came back in 2005, I was more than interested, I was instantly obsessed again. It was like being a kid. One of the interesting things is, as you saw from the new version, the Virgin New Adventures, the fans became the producers. It's a really distinctive thing about the series. Russell T Davies, fan. Stephen Moffat, fan. This is Stephen Moffat as a child reading the novelisation of the Daleks by David Whittaker. David Tennant, fan. Peter Capaldi, fan. Lots of the writers and producers, fans. It became this kind of thing that the fans were producing for fans, which has involved all sorts of tensions since the new series started, because it's kind of assumed they will make stuff for fans, but actually what they're trying to do is make stuff for a mainstream audience. The fans will watch anyway, by and large. I thought this was quite a nice quotation from Stephen Moffat. It says, "As an adult, I'm not really scared of the dark anymore. I'm scared of getting ill or global warming, but traditional horror scares belong to childhood. This is what Doctor Who does so brilliantly. It returns you to your childhood. And I've passed it on to my kids. I've infected them. That's Molly, actually. She's now 15 and she'd be devastated to think I was showing this, but she is hidden behind the Cyberman masks, 1975, well, 68, 75 version. That's, yeah, our Grace just took herself upstairs one day and knitted a Matt Smith. No pattern, just knitted it. Came down, look, I've knitted Matt Smith. I thought it was kind of sweet. I was trying to find the one where my youngest daughter put a cloche on her head in the back garden and pretended to be a Sontaran, but I couldn't find it. It's somewhere. So it has kind of infected them. And quite early on, since I arrived at UH in 1999, and it took a while, but I gradually began to sort of slip bits of Doctor Who into my teaching. It started on SASAM, Software Systems for the Arts and Media. Kim will remember it well. And we did a module called Cyber Cultures, and there was a week where I was doing some stuff about techno-fear, so I showed an episode from Genesis of the Daleks. And at that time, it wasn't back on air, and the students didn't know what the hell this thing was, most of them. Then I ran one of the elective modules called Gods and Monsters, and there was quite a... Well, pretty much, although it was about mythologies, this is really where this notion for a book began, because I realised every week I was referencing something in Doctor Who as picking up on mythological strands, and so I realised there's a kind of theme here. So that's kind of the genesis of the thing, I think. And then I did eventually put my money where my mouth is and start writing some stuff. So I got a chapter published in the Paul Booth edited fan phenomena book, Doctor Who, which was really about nostalgia. It was about nostalgia in Doctor Who and nostalgia of Doctor Who. And that kind of gave me a little appetite to think, well, actually, maybe I can do some academic work on this and justify it and feel quite good about it, and it might even be referable and so on. I had a little bit of previous. I had published one thing when I was a teenager, which was this. This was one of the many books brought out to cash in on the 20th anniversary, and I got a drawing put in it, and I was so happy. This was me at the age of 13, so dead chuffed with that. These are autographs. These are the top trumps I used to make at school. I only got a few of them left. It's tragic, but if you see, I used to pester the BBC. We held a Doctor Who exhibition in my garage, and the BBC phoned my mum and said, "You can't do this without copyright clearance." And Mum said, "They're 10 years old." And the BBC sort of backed down, but they obviously got wind that we were doing this really, because I'd written to them saying, "Can we borrow some props? Can we borrow some costumes?" And the BBC were very cross with my mum. And my mum said, "What, BBC? Why are you phoning?" So, you know, I was obsessed with Janet Fielding. 2 autographs from her, master. Look at this. 1 Peter Davison autograph. 2, 3. Even Adric. 1, 2. Quite sad. And then I got a letter typed from Janet Fielding. Oh, teenage dreams. Anyway, so I tried to take it seriously a couple of years ago and got a chapter published. And then, not long after that, in fact, that came out around June, I think, and then in September of that year, we had at the university, organised by Kim Akas and Stephen Peacock over in Humanities, we had a conference. I can't find my remote. Let's see what I did with it. We had the conference, and I actually did something I've never done before. I went up to a publisher and harassed them and said, look, because I knew they did a series called Who Watching. This was the I.B.Tauris publisher, Philippa Brewster. I said, look, you're interested in a book about Doctor Who and mythology? And she said, yeah, go on, give me send me a proposal and I'll have a look at it. So I did, and that's where the book comes in. That's where it starts from. So, a little bit of academic context. There wasn't a lot. If I'd been really smart and I'd thought about writing this book 10 years ago, it would have been much easier for me because my lit review would have been very short. There was only 1 book available up until 2005, and it was this one. This came out in 1983, has a very bad reputation for being sort of really heavy and dense and overly theoretical. And it came out of that sort of big movement for cultural theory in the 1980s. It's actually, and I've reread it recently, when I first read it I couldn't understand a word of it. I have reread it recently, I understood most words, and I think it's actually a really very good book, very good first attempt. It's very, very earnest, it takes itself very seriously, but it's got some very useful reading still in it. It came out in 1983. Prior to that, there'd just been a few sort of stray articles. Tulloch himself had published an article, John Fiske had written something, but there wasn't a great deal of sort of academic stuff. Loads of fan material, Doctor Who Weekly and so on, which had become monthly, but there was very little academic material available. But it became a bit of a joke, the Tulloch Alvarado book. It even became satirised in the series itself. This is a scene for one of the most ridiculous cliffhangers, by the way. Sylvester McCoy hanging off an ice cliff for no apparent reason that I've ever been able to work out. Actually, he's supposed to be trying to climb over it and he falls, but all you see is him walking along and then him hanging from his brolly. Anyway, there's a scene in this where the Doctor talks to a guard on this ice world planet, and in the novelised version it goes like this. The guard says, the guard's face lit up, "You've no idea what a relief it is for me to have such a stimulating philosophical discussion. There are so few intellectuals about these days." The Doctor smiled and noticed that Glitz had now disappeared through the door, but the guard had no intention of letting the Doctor leave so soon. "Tell me, what are your views on the assertion that the semiotic thickness of a performed text varies according to the redundancy of auxiliary performance codes?" Semiotics. The Doctor began to worry. This was going to be a very difficult conversation. And the scriptwriter actually, they quoted Tulloch and Alvarado's book in the voice of the guard within the programme. It's also, for media studies folk among you, it's a story which has characters called McLuhan, Belash, Bazan, Krakow, Arnhem, Podovkin and so on. So it's a kind of slightly knowing story. Around 2005, things began to pick up. As I say, this is where things become quite crowded in the Doctor Who academic discourse market. But you get a kind of argument going on within the academic discourse. James Chapman's done a really good, thorough, detailed and entertaining history of the series. He's a historian, a television historian. He doesn't like theory. And he has this rather wonderful phrase where he says, "Popular culture can be taken seriously without recourse to the impenetrable critical language of high theory. The Doctor may have conquered Daleks, Cybermen and Ice Warriors, but would he survive an encounter with Foucault, Derrida or Deleuze?" And then, to counter that, Matt Hills, who's written probably the best study so far of the Return series, which is Triumph of a Time Lord. Matt Hills, I think quite persuasively for me, says, "One person's jargon's another person's useful vocabulary. Fandom is often as guilty of this as academia. The word squee," anyone? Go on, Danny, what's squee?
Something excited.
Squee!
Yes.
Yeah. It's a fanboy or fangirl utterance to express excitement. There's a bit of jargon for those who aren't fan people. The word squee probably doesn't mean much to non-fans, just as the word signifier won't mean much to those who aren't already media students. Could drop in the word fan wank at that point, which is one of my favourites. And again, won't mean a lot to people who haven't come across it before. So-called jargon is in reality just another cultural group's language that we don't want to spend time getting to grips with. But my favourite response to Chapman's put down is this from Matthew Sweet when he reviewed the book in, I think, The Independent. He said, "Doctor Who is a monstrous, unstoppable, ever-growing discourse. So what would happen if, on some time trip to the left bank in the 1970s, Deleuze, Derrida and Foucault encountered Doctor Who? That's easy. It would simply slide on top of them like a giant green blancmange with a 4-foot phallus." This is what he's referring to. This is the Typhonian Erato from the story A Creature from the Pit. Not one of the best of the late 70s, I have to say. It's this big green plant-like creature that kind of rolls over people, but you find out it's actually trying to talk to them. That's how they communicate. But unfortunately, it crushes people in the process. The Doctor worked out that you could actually talk to it by talking into this long phallic object. But it's not a photograph that's aged well. Moving on. So I talked to this publisher from I.B.Tauris. They have a series called Who Watching, which is now quite a populated set of books, and that's where my book is going to fit. And indeed, I've also put a proposal in for an edited collection, which they seem very interested in, so hopefully there'll be a couple joining this. This is just the blurb from their website explaining why they have the Who Watching series. I mean, presumably partly because it's a good marketing strategy, but also they're trying to create a kind of discourse around the subject. And Matt Hills has borrowed a phrase from Paul Mars to talk about the beginning of Doctor Who studies, which I think it's now underway. It's happening. So my focus really is on the stories, this notion of the myths and stories of Doctor Who. This is a quote from a book which came out in 2007 with one of the best titles, Time and Relative Dissertations in Space. David Butler writes, "If nothing else, Doctor Who merits study as the source of a considerable body of stories told to several generations of children in Britain and beyond. The qualities the Doctor relies on to overcome his enemies and the nature of the monsters and challenges he encounters are important messages being transmitted to developing minds. So on one level, just because it's been watched by so many generations of children, it's worth studying. But one of the things to notice off the back of this is it's never been intended as a children's programme. It was never made by the children's department at the BBC. It was made by the drama department. And it's always had that kind of slightly, who are its audience? By the late 70s into the 80s, the audience was people who were in their teens, early 20s. It wasn't really the original target audience. And now, of course, there are as many people of my age watch it as there are people of my kids' age who watch it. In that book by Butler, there is a really useful essay, and various people have talked about the myths of Doctor Who before, so I'm not the first, but I am the first to try and do it as a kind of full-length study. Rafer writes quite a useful little essay about the myths of Doctor Who, and he talks about the Doctor as being a carrier and purveyor of his own myth, but also he encounters images and patterns drawn from ancient world mythology. The way the Doctor confronts and feeds into myth reveals something of the enduring nature and appeal of mythic narratives and symbols, and is a contributory factor in the mysticism of the character. There is something about the type of story it is and the kind of accumulated narrative that it is that I think lends it to being thought of as a mythology. And as I say, it's partly due to almost the anonymity or the various signatures, as Tulloch and Alvarado call it. There's always been different producers always bring their own stamp to the programme. There's been so many different writers have worked for the series as well, and they all bring something slightly different. There are, of course, and this is the other thing I've got bogged down, in thinking I understood about myth studies, and there's this notion of Doctor Who as mythopoeia. It's a series of generated myths, but also there's the mythography of it, the studying of mythology. And trying to get to grips with myth studies is almost as difficult as trying to get to grips with Doctor Who studies, because there's so much been written about myths and so many arguments and different ways of looking at it. I've boiled it down. These are overlapping, of course. There's no neat categories here. There is the basic notion of myths as stories, what Joseph Campbell called wonder tales, and Doctor Who fits nicely into that. This is the basic notion of myths as fictions. And of course, within culture, we talk about myths as things that aren't true as well. It's often a pejorative term. Myths as paradigms of perfection. That phrase comes from Lawrence Coop. Rituals and systems of belief. This is the kind of myth that we get if we read Fraser's Golden Bough, if you've got a spare couple of lifetimes to wade through it. Jesse Weston's book From Ritual to Romance. Mircea Eliade, the Romanian mythographer. It's also, if you read T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, that's the kind of mythology he's looking at. It's a mythology that, although it seems to be fragmentary, is actually confirming his notably conservative worldview. There's myth as structures of cultural meaning, which is almost the same thing, but from a sort of questioning, loosely put it, left-wing perspective. Levi-Strauss, Northrop Frye, and then there's the bit I'm most familiar with really coming into this, which is myth as ideology, which is really the Roland Barthes notion. Marina Warner doing it from a feminist perspective as well. Now, the way I'm using this, and I had to clarify this for the publisher, is I'm using them all because I don't see any reason to distinguish. I'm quite happy to take the thing on as a kind of to actually see how the different kinds of mythic viewpoint can actually be mapped across the series, because I think they're all relevant in various ways. Part of my reasoning for that is because Doctor Who is not a consistent object. There is no whole, complete, coherent text. It's a bit of a mess, frankly, but it's a rather wonderful mess. Kim Newman's written that inconsistency was built into the format from the outset, to the eventual frustration of fans who would like to hammer the whole series into some overarching design. This is an attempt to hammer it into an overarching design. This is a work of obsession and madness. It's rather beautiful. Lance Parkin and Lars Pearson have tried to make a coherent sense of the chronology of Doctor Who's stories from creation to the end of the universe. So there are over 1,400 stories in here. This is the TV series, it's the novels, it's the big Finish audios, it's pretty much everything except the fan fiction and the movies. You have to be mad to attempt something like this, but they have attempted it, and fans have been trying to make sense of the chronology for years. I don't think there's any point, frankly, and I don't want to get involved in discussions about canon because I don't care. The canon is meaningless in Doctor Who terms. Everything that's been made with the tag Doctor Who on it, or even things which are spin-off, to me are relevant, and they're part of the accumulating mythology. And for that, I go to Paul Ricoeur and this notion of myth as possibility. If I was to select one notion of myth that I'm going to use, it's this. And particularly this phrase from Ricoeur, where he says that myth is a disclosure of unprecedented worlds, an opening onto other possible worlds which transcend the established limits of our actual world. That's what I think Doctor Who does. It's a wonderful definition. It's not what he was talking about. It's not in his mind at all. But that's the kind of myth that I'm really working towards. It's also picked up by Bart. This is in his essay in Image, Music, Text, which is actually an analysis of the wrestling between Jacob and the angel. And it ends with this, which is really Bart saying, I don't want to do the Eliade Fraser type myth analysis where I close everything down and say this is what it means. It's about saying myth is about opening things up to interpretation and to meaning. So Bart says the problem at least posed for me is exactly to manage not to reduce the text to a signified, whatever it may be, historical, economic, folkloristic, or kerygmatic. That's to do with preaching. It's a kind of religious closing down. It's the Fraser Western approach. But to hold its signifiance, French is awful. I was going to say significance, fully open. Because it was about wrestling an angel, I put a weeping angel on there. There are things I'm having to deal with, which is this question of what genre Doctor Who fits in. Again, a bit like canon, I don't really care. Is it science fiction? Lots of people say it isn't. Probably a bit science fiction and a bit not. It's often referred to as the longest running science fiction television series, but it's not a genre that it sits comfortably in because it's so eccentric. It's a little odd. If you take Darko Suvin's very famous approach to science fiction, it's estranging. It takes you out of the normal world and puts you into something different. But it's not great in terms of what Suvin calls cognition, the notion that it ties into real science or believable science. So I take this from, this is actually Stephen Moffat. It says, for me, Doctor Who literally is a fairy tale. It's not really science fiction. It's not out in space. It's set under your bed. It makes children of everyone who watches it. And I think probably more usefully, it is often referred to as science fantasy. And I think that works better for me. Because you still have this estrangement, what Catherine Fawkes talks about as ontological rupture, break with reality, but it seems to navigate quite nicely between Todorov's notions of the fantastic, this sense of the marvellous, something which is inexplainable, supernatural, magical, and the uncanny, which seems strange perceptually but can be explained through rational causes, and it bobs between these. But for instance, you know, the most recent series had the moon turning out to be an egg, which lots of people say, oh, this is terrible science. The moon isn't an egg. We know the moon's not an egg. And people got very irate about this. And I thought, it's a story. It's not real. They're not saying it's really an egg any more than it's made out of cheese. These are images from The Mind Robber, which is a Patrick Troughton story set in the land of fiction, where you have Gulliver from Gulliver's Travels talking only words that Jonathan Swift wrote for him. You have this futuristic superhero called the Carcass. You have Rapunzel. You have Clockwork Soldiers and so on. It's fantasy. And there's no attempt to make it seem scientifically coherent or meaningful. This is the Destroyer from Battlefield, Sylvester McCoy story. Nice little bit of dialogue about this very point where the Doctor says, this spaceship wasn't built, it was grown. Who grows spaceships? Very advanced bioengineers. Ask a stupid question. Well, if they're grown, how do they fly? Magic. Oh, be feasible, Professor. What is Clarke's law? Any advanced form of technology is indistinguishable from magic. Well, the reverse is also true. You do get down the history moments where it becomes much more science fictional. When Christopher H. Bidmead took over as script editor for a year, 1980, it's the final Tom Baker season, he had a background as a science writer and he was very keen to tie in notions of universal entropy and so on, real hard science themes. Got very low ratings actually, but it's one of my favourite seasons, but he tried to build a kind of hard science element into it. By the time you get to Moffat, you've really got this emphasis on fairy tale and fantasy, which as I say has been criticised for bad science. That's in The Forest of the Night from the last series, which was about planet Earth being taken over by vegetation, which is trying to protect us from solar flares, and some people said that would never happen. I thought, no, probably won't. Does it matter? So part of what will inform the study is this notion of the transmediation of Doctor Who. It long ago outgrew the bounds of television. It became these new adventure novels. This is a very famous one called Lungbarrow. BBC won't renew the licence on these, so they can't be republished, which means if you try and buy this now, it costs about 100 quid. You can download the PDF for nothing. I didn't say that. Big Finish is still going. They've produced hundreds of their audios now. There are computer games. It is, and has for a long time, spread out its tentacles. Indeed, right the way back So the 60s and 70s, that's my first Doctor Who annual. My granny bought me one every year. This is 1977. Tom Baker signed it. Signed it as the Doctor because he was in role at the time. Because they're full of stories and those all become part of this canon that doesn't exist and that I don't want to argue about. There is also the challenge of dealing with the fact that the mythology's outgrown Doctor Who itself, so there's the kind of hyperdiegesis, the story spreading out into other elements which are part of the same story universe, the same fictional universe, but are not Doctor Who. Torchwood, Sarah Jane Adventures, things like Iris Wildtime. Paul Mars developed this character who is here, played by Katie Manning, who played Jo Grant, the companion for, or one of the companions for John Pertwee. But Iris Wildtime is a Time Lord living on Earth. No, Doctor isn't involved in these stories, but it's quite clearly part of the same universe. So as I say, I'm not going to get into the canon question. Parkin and Pearson put it very nicely, I think, and this is the reason why I'm not going to get into the canon question, because you just spend the rest of your life, you just go mad. They say now with dozens of new books, audios, comic strips, short stories, and a new TV series, not to mention spin-offs, it's almost certainly impossible to keep track of every new Doctor Who story, let alone put them all in a coherent, never mind consistent framework. References can contradict other references in the same story, let alone ones in stories written 40 years later for a different medium by someone who wasn't even born the year the original writer died. It's what happens to myths. Now, there's no true version of the Hercules myth, there's no true version of Perseus myth and so on. So I take Pierce Britton's line, which is you can't do a totalising analysis. Doctor Who, as he says, is an unwieldy skein of texts, and that's how I'm going to treat it. Harrigan and Wardrip Froon's notion of a vast narrative is the way I think it has to be grasped. So, moving towards the end, I think. This is how the book's structured. I'm not doing it chronologically because I don't want to. I'm doing it thematically. 4 main strands. I'm going to look at the kind of discourses around Doctor Who, which is the critical and fan discourses, and often the kind of competing mythologies within those. I'm going to look at it as an intratextual mythology. Doctor Who fans, producers and writers talk within its own mythology. They refer to itself. They have arguments about continuity and breaches in continuity, whether it was a really big mistake that Paul McGann's Doctor in the 1966 movie was revealed to be half human, and everyone goes, that's wrong, he can't be half human because it's said before that he's not, and so on. Also the intertextuality, how it relates to other sources, whether those are mythological, historical and so on. And I'm going to look at the nature of the hero's journey. This will enable me to look at the Doctor as a kind of unsettled character. Regeneration and so on ensures that, but it ties in nicely to notions of place within the stories and ideas of materiality. I want to look at set design. I want to look at the sort of myths of the wobbly set. Sometimes you got wobbly sets, but actually most of the time the sets were pretty well made. It's a kind of it's a reflection on how we view the past as being sort of slightly inept and slightly amateurish. I want to look at stories. There are tropes of beginning and end, creation myths and endings and so on, which are all part of mythic structures. That's my chapters. And strangely, since I submitted the proposal, I cannot remember why it's called that. Oh, no, it's the first one. Could, should, won't, ever. It's a quote from somewhere in the series, and I can't track it down. I can't remember why I called it that. So that was really clever. I might have to change that one. So finally, just a few little things I can pick up on during the book. Kim Newman talks about the series as a voracious gobbler of ideas. Its originality is in the vehicle, really. The content is a kind of endless recycling of stuff that already exists. This is at least 3 sort of werewolf mythologies. Primords, 1970. This is the Lucosa from 1986. That's Tooth and Claw, the werewolf from the David Tennant era. There have been at least 4 Minotaurs in Doctor Who's history. That's the Mind Robber. That's Time Monster, John Pertwee story. That's the Naimon. Here we're into the reign of Matt Smith. So the same myth coming back. There have been at least 3 destructions of 3 different Atlantises within Doctor Who's history. That's one from the Patrick Troughton era with the fish people. Lots of vampires, from an android vampire in a William Hartnell story which kills a load of Daleks, to this, the Axons were originally called the Vampire from Space. These are actual vampires, servants of the Great Vampire, 1980. Hemivores from 1989. Plasmavore, 2007. Vampires of Venice, which are not real vampires, they turn out to be funny fish things, but never mind, they look like vampires there. Various recyclings of the Phantom of the Opera myth, and I could go on about recyclings of the Beauty and the Beast myth. Sharrow's Jeck takes a fancy to Perry, but there's other Beauty and the Beast myths like the giant robot and Sarah Jane Smith back in 1975. So it's taking established stuff and reusing it. Mummy myths, Pyramids of Mars, 1975, and this year the Mummy on the Orient Express. Myths of family. People have talked a lot about Russell T Davies making the programme into a soap opera, and it has some truth in it, but actually it was a soap opera from the start. It begins with two school teachers investigating one of their pupils. That's soap opera stuff, it's Waterloo Road. It leads in a slightly different direction from Waterloo Road. History treated as myth. You get this very famous, rather wonderful historical story called The Aztecs, where Barbara is thought to be the goddess Yetaxa, and she tries to stop human sacrifice in Aztec culture, and the doctor says, you can't do this, you cannot rewrite history, not one line. This is a line quoted by River Song years later. But then just a year later, you've got the doctor saying history doesn't mean anything when you travel in time and space, in which case you can play around with it all you want. So you get lovely historical myths like the Second World War as it appeared in the Doctor Dances. You've got political anxiety bubbling through, which is really a kind of historical anxiety. The Daleks as Nazis, it's an old reading, but it's valid, I think, and it's validated by Terry Nation himself. Technological anxieties. Cybermen are the best example, but they're not the only one. And then, as I say, mythologies of mimesis or representational realism. Invasion of the Dinosaurs, 1975. Look at the model work, ho ho. Here's a CGI T-Rex from Deep Breath. There's an interesting little narrative going on in terms of how we create spectacle there. So I'm just closing here with this couple of lines from Mummy on the Orient Express. The doctor's talking to Professor Moorhouse, who says, well, you certainly know a little mythology. I know a lot, because from time to time, it turns out to be true.